Now that the United States had won its independence from Britain, the next thing to decide was, what are we going to do? Are we going to be a United States, a single nation? Are we going to have a government to unify us all? During the war, we had the Articles of Confederation, and the Continental Congress had acted as our government. And so, in the years after the war, we proceeded with this as our central unifying form of government. However, it became very quickly apparent that this was not a strong enough central government. First of all, we had some problems we had to deal with. We had to pay a large debt. We had borrowed money from other countries. We had borrowed money from individuals as a nation, as a Continental Congress. Also, each of the colonies, New York, Virginia, Rhode Island, every colony, had borrowed money from other countries and from individuals. And therefore, we had a huge amount of debt that had to be paid. But the Articles of Confederation did not give our central government the right to tax us, to be able to raise the money. Instead, they had to request that the colonies raise the money and use it to pay off our national debt. And so that becomes problematic. Also, the Articles of Confederation did not have power for the central government to settle disputes between colonies. So if a couple of colonies got in an argument over trade between their colonies, or even a land dispute over a border between their colonies, the central government didn't have the ability to step in and say, this is the way things are going to be. So it doesn't have a lot of power. And that became apparent when in Massachusetts, a little thing you read about in your reading, Shays Rebellion occurs, where soldiers who felt like they were not being treated well, they were being taxed, and the demand was they had to pay in specie, in coin, rather than in paper money, and that's what they had been paid in. And so these soldiers were having their land foreclosed. They felt like this was not fair. They had rebelled against the Massachusetts government, but under the Articles of Confederation, our national government really didn't have authority to go in and stop this crisis. Massachusetts had to deal with it themselves. And so our government seems relatively weak. And at this point, the suggestion is made by the Continental Congress that we need to amend the Articles of Confederation and give more power to the central government. Now, that was possible. The way the Articles of Confederation were set up, first of all, if you wanted to pass any law nationally, there were 13 states, every state had a vote, and you had to have 9 out of 13 states approve any law. And that was hard enough. But to make things harder, if you wanted to amend the Articles of Confederation, you would have to have 13 out of 13 votes to approve amending the Articles. Nevertheless, the suggestion is made that they meet at Philadelphia and they amend the Articles. Right away, they have a problem. Little bitty Rhode Island is afraid if we give too much power to a central government, our tiny little colony is going to be ran over by everybody else, and they won't even send delegates. So right away, you're not going to have the votes you need to amend the Articles of Confederation. But they arrive, delegates from the other 12 colonies, and in 1887, they begin the Constitutional Convention, as it will be called. They chose George Washington to preside over the convention. Washington really wanted to go home. He had fought a war for nearly a decade, and he was ready to retire and to enjoy his life. But no, we need him. We need him to come here because he's the guy that people will respect and people will listen to, and he can keep control of this convention. So he agrees. He is going to lead the convention. And so delegates from around the United States show up, and the idea is they're supposed to revise the Articles of Confederation. Instead, they wadded them up, threw them away, and wrote a whole new document. So, as they begin writing this Constitution, the man who's going to have the most influence on it is James Madison of Virginia. He's known as the father of the Constitution, and he really basically wrote the whole thing before he showed up. And then he's going to have it presented. It'll be Edmund Randolph of Virginia that will present what's called the Virginia Plan. Now, the Virginia Plan sets up a government with 3 branches, which is what Enlightenment philosophers had talked about and what Britain had. And we had seen kind of modeled in our own colonies. And so he suggests an executive branch with a president. We're going to have a legislative branch with a bicameral Senate and House of Representatives. We're going to have 2 houses in our legislature. And then we're going to have, thirdly, a court system. So that is his plan. Now, the Virginia plan, however, Virginia is a big state with a big population. And in their opinion, the way you decide how many members in Congress a state should have is based on your population. And so the Virginia plan plans to have a Senate based on population and a House of Representatives based on population. This would benefit big states. To oppose this plan, William Patterson of New Jersey suggests what's called the New Jersey Plan, where he says, no, we're going to base representation equally. Everybody gets the same number of votes. And so we're at an impasse. We're arguing over this issue. Ultimately, it's decided in what is known as the Connecticut Compromise, because it's presented by Roger Sherman of Connecticut, or the Great Compromise, that we are going to have a bicameral, a 2-house legislature. And the upper house, like the New Jersey plan had said, will have 2, it ends up we decide there's going to be 2 senators, every state, no matter how big or small you are. So it's equal representation there, protecting small states. But in the House, we're going to have population as the basis for representation. So big states like New York and Virginia are going to get a much larger representation. And it makes it fair for them. And that means neither the small states nor the big states are going to have an advantage. It actually creates a government that is, a little bit inefficient. We have a government that's set up to protect people's rights. And so things don't get through our government. If you ever wonder why our government is so slow and it's hard to get stuff done, well, it's kind of a good thing because it was set up so that little states are protected, so that big states are protected, so that individuals' rights are protected. And our government doesn't move quick, and it doesn't move what you'd call efficiently. But that's partially so that they can't just start violating our rights. So there is something positive about that. Now, there's another argument, too, though, at this time, and that's how are we going to decide how many people are counted to decide the population of a state? See, the southern states had large slave populations. Virginia had a slave population that was over a quarter of the population of their state. So, do we count the slaves? Well, Virginia said, yes, we count the slaves. And the North said, that's not fair. They're not citizens. Why should they get counted in deciding how many votes you have in Congress? But then when it came time to decide how much tax a state should pay, Northerners said, oh, but Virginia, when we decide how much tax your state's going to pay, we're going to count the slave population. And Virginia says, that's taxation without representation. That's not fair. And so they argue, and they decide on what's called the 3/5 compromise, where they are going to count 3/5 of the slaves both for representation and for taxation. Now, of course, the slaves themselves won't actually get to vote and won't have any real representation. That's a whole other issue we're going to have to deal with later. But they come up with a compromise, and we move forward. Now, the way they set things up, the Senate is considered, so we'll first of all look at this legislative branch, and it's dealt with in Article 1 of the Constitution. The Senate was considered the upper chamber, and so they are going to have 2 senators for every state, and they will have certain responsibilities and requirements. So first of all, if you want to be a senator, you must be 30 years old. You're elected by your state, and the manner that that's done is changed over the years. And you have a 6-year term. However, in the House of Representatives, which is the lower house, it's going to be based on population, and you can be younger. You can be 25 years old, and you're elected by your district. and you only have a 2-year term. Now, the way they set this up is important. First of all, senators are expected to be a little older, a little wiser. You want people who have experience making decisions. At the same time, you want people who are young and idealistic, who haven't become old and bitter yet. So allowing people younger into the House of Representatives gives you that opportunity. So you have a little bit of both. Also, the fact that the people in the House of Representatives are elected by your district, that sets up the situation where, like here in Texas today, we have 2 right now Republican senators because Texas is dominantly a Republican state. However, if you look at our representatives in the House, we have both Republicans and Democrats. Now, Democrats couldn't win currently the way our current political situation is in a statewide vote. But because you're elected by district, Democrats get a voice. So place like Dallas, they elect a Democrat. Place like Tyler, they elect a Republican. But we have a mix of both, giving better representation to local people in our governments. That's a good plan. Also, that 6-year and 2-year term is important. If you are a senator, let's say they came up with some wonderful new plan to get rid of oil, because there's a new energy that they've got now, and it's going to create jobs, and it's going to clean the environment, and it's going to be good for America. But here in Texas, we aren't going to like that. We're in the oil industry. So a congressman from our part of the state, he's not voting for that. We'll throw him out on his ear. But a senator from Texas could look at it and say, you know what, it's not going to be good for the oil industry. But over time, the oil industry can convert to this new energy, and those people can get their jobs in the new industry, and it's going to be good in the long run. So he could look at that, and he could say, all right, I got 6 years to be proven right. So a senator can vote for something, and he has time, unless he's getting close to his election, he has time to see that, let people see that what he voted for was good. But, if we're here in Texas and we're worried right now about what's going to happen to the oil industry, we don't like the idea that our congressmen aren't going to listen to us. So we like the idea that we can throw somebody out on their ear immediately if they don't do what we want. So we do have representatives who have to listen to us and who have to speak our voice, because they're only in for 2 years. As soon as they win an election, they're immediately campaigning to get reelected. So it's kind of gives us a balance there of people who can look at the long term and people who must represent us as we feel right now. And so we've got a balance there. Now, the duties of the Congress are, if you sum it up in one phrase, to make the laws. And specifically, laws originate here. They have to pass both houses. So if a senator proposes a bill and it passes the Senate, then it has to go to the House and it has to be approved there. If they make changes and add things to it, it's no longer the same. So after they approve it, it has to go back to the Senate and get approved. And if they make changes, it might go back and forth, back and forth. If you've ever watched that old Saturday morning Schoolhouse Rock video, I'm Just a Bill, it dramatizes it pretty well. But if the same exact version of the bill passes both houses, it finally will go to the president's desk and maybe become a law. So they create the laws. Also, they have certain powers and responsibilities which allow them to put limitations on the other 2 branches. This system of checks and balances is very important. No one person, as president, can become a dictator if we keep things in balance. The Congress can't strip the president of his power and just run over him and do things. And the courts can't just start legislating from the bench if we keep a balance between the branches of government. And so, this is a very important concept built into our Constitution. So first of all, one of the checks that they have is on the president himself. The Senate, being the upper house, they get to approve the people that the president picks to serve in certain positions. They also have to approve treaties that he signs, and the Congress is responsible for declaring war. Now, as we get into the late 20th century, in 1302, we'll see that we, after Vietnam, start making some changes in that we haven't declared war in the United States since World War II. We fought a bunch of wars, but they weren't declared wars. So things are going to change in the late 20th century. But initially, this idea of being able to declare war, the president can't do it himself. He has to ask Congress. Also, if the president vetoes a bill, says no to it, if there's enough congressmen in the House and in the Senate to override the president's veto, they can make it a law anyway, which is a good thing. If everyone's in favor of it except the president, he's standing in the way, we can still get a law. And we have seen that happen in the past, but it's very hard to do. You have to have a 2/3. Most of the time when they vote on things, it's just a simple majority. If one more person than half vote for it, it passes that House. But in the case of an override, you have to have 2/3 of the people in the House and 2/3 of the people in the Senate vote to override. And when you consider the fact that rarely does either of our two major political parties have that many people in the House or in the Senate, then you understand that a president, whether he's Democrat or Republican, he's going to have people in his own party vote to override his veto if it's going to be overridden. So that's not easy to do, but it can be done. Now, a very important thing, going back to the Magna Carta and back to the beginnings of British Parliament, is the power of the purse. The Congress sets the budget. They're going to give the president the money he needs to run his programs. And that means that if they don't like something the president wants to do, they don't have to fund it. So it's a very powerful tool in keeping the president in check. Now, they also have to keep the court system in check. So these judges that the president will get to pick for the court system, they get to approve them. And on top of that, if either the president or a judge commits a high crime or misdemeanor, it's a little vague wording there, against the United States, if they become a problem, they can be removed from office. So the process would be the lower house, the House of Representatives, would bring up charges against that individual, whether it's a judge or a president, and they would vote. And a simple majority will allow them to impeach the president, meaning put him on trial, or her someday maybe, for this crime against the country. But then it goes to the Senate, and in the Senate, they will decide if they're guilty and will be removed. Now, the executive branch is going to be made up of a president and his cabinet. So you have a president, a vice president, and the heads of all the departments. And this becomes the line of succession. If something were to happen to the president, the vice president would replace him. If something were to happen to the vice president, then we would go first to the Speaker of the House, and then so on down the list of all the government officials that are in line for the presidency. So we have a plan. Now, the requirements to be president, and therefore vice president, you have to be 35 years old. We want somebody that's even more experienced than senators. You must be a natural-born citizen because we want to be sure you're loyal to America first. It's a 4-year term. Initially, we didn't put a term limit, though. You could be elected president as many times as you want, but as we will see, Washington will step down after 2 terms, and that will become the standard. And eventually, that will become the law in the 1950s. We'll only have one president in our history that ever served more than 2 terms. And the president is elected by an electoral college, not directly by our votes. And this was kind of done by some of the elitists like old Hamilton. I'm not a fan of Hamilton. But he and other elitists, they're a little concerned that common folks won't make good choices and that there needs to be kind of a fail-safe in between the common vote, the popular vote, and the actual choosing of a president. So the way it works is every state votes, you vote, for who you want to be president. But within each state, there's a slate of electors. In our modern system with Democrats and Republicans, there's Republican electors, Democratic electors, and if the Republican wins the state, then he gets in all but 2 of our states, the way it's set up, all the votes here in Texas would go to the Republican candidate. So all of his group of electors would go to the Electoral College. Only two of our states, Nebraska and I believe, I want to say it's Maine, I might be saying that wrong off the top of my head, but those are the two states that split their electors by the percentage of the vote. But the other 48, it's winner take all. Now, the duty of the president is to enforce the law. His job, or someday maybe her job, is to take the laws that the Congress makes and carry them out. So, enforcing federal laws is done through the office of the president. The FBI, they're underneath the president's department, and they go out and enforce federal law. In addition to that, the president is commander-in-chief of our military. We have a civilian as the head of our military that answers to us, the people. Therefore, we have a little bit more security to believe that our military will stay loyal. That's a check on our military power. And the president gets to make military decisions. But remember, he's checked in his power because he can't declare war, and also the military budget runs through Congress. The president, through the ambassadors that he selects, is to make treaties with other countries. But again, his power is checked by Congress approving those treaties. And he gets to appoint who he wants to be the different judges, ambassadors, and heads of all of his departments. But the higher offices have to be approved again by Congress. So it goes back and forth, keeping power balanced. And the president gets to sign the laws. And if he doesn't like a law, his biggest power is veto. He can declare, I forbid. This is what veto means in Latin. He can veto a law. However, as we've seen, Congress could override a law, but it's very hard to do. And his power over the court system is he gets to appoint judges. So these are the powers of the president. Now finally, we have the judicial branch, and our federal judicial branch is made up of, first of all, local district courts. Those are scattered around the country. Then there's the Court of Appeals. There's a few of those around the country. And finally, the highest court in the land, the Supreme Court. All of these judges are appointed by the president and approved by Congress. Now, the requirements, surprisingly, are pretty light. The president picks you, Congress approves you. End of story. You don't have to have a law degree. You don't have to have experience. He could go down to the Zippy Mart and get the guy running the soda machine to be a judge if Congress approves. But of course, they pick highly qualified people because you have to get congressional approval, and the vast majority of our judges are highly qualified. I hope all of them, but I'll say the vast majority. And they get to serve for life. It's a permanent job. Only if they do something to get themselves removed by impeachment can they lose their job. Otherwise, they stay until they retire or until they die. Now, their job is to interpret the law. That means they decide if you've broken the law. They may hand down the penalties, decide what those penalties are, and in some cases, they decide if a law is even legal. So they hear cases involving breaking federal crimes. But the Supreme Court, if you're running let's say, a counterfeiting operation, you'd go to a district court. And you might, if you were found guilty, be able to appeal to a court of appeals. However, the Supreme Court doesn't care if you're guilty or not. That's not their job, really, to decide if you were guilty. They figured that out at the lower courts. What they're going to hear is cases like, say, you have a fully automatic rifle and you're arrested for having an illegal firearm, but you say, no, the Second Amendment says I can have it. Well, you lose because you had the firearm, and then you lose at the Court of Appeal because you had the firearm, but the Supreme Court says, but their argument is that this is unconstitutional to forbid them this firearm because of the Second Amendment. So they will hear your case, and they will decide through what the process called judicial review if indeed this law was unconstitutional. And so they actually usually are making rulings about how laws should be enforced, how they should be interpreted, rather than whether you broke a law or not. And so that's their big check on the power of the president and the power of the Congress. Now, after we get through writing this Constitution, they set up a plan of ratification. And they didn't say all the states had to ratify. They said if 9 states will ratify, then at that point, we will begin using it as our new government. The problem was we had to make sure not only that we got 9 states to ratify, but that the right states ratified. If New York and Virginia aren't in, those are our biggest states, it isn't going to work. And the problem was some people were really concerned that we're giving too much power to the government and that our individual rights would not be respected. And so, in order to win over voters, John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison, guys who later politically are going to have a lot of differences, they're all what we will call, at this point, Federalists. Now, this isn't the Federalist Party, which will come around soon. This means, as a Federalist, you're for the federal Constitution. An anti-Federalist, they're against the Constitution. Doesn't mean they're anti-American. Doesn't even mean they don't want us to have a national government, but they're afraid this Constitution will be too powerful and they want to vote against it. So in order to win people over, Jay and Madison and Hamilton, they write articles, which are known as the Federalist Papers, and have them published in newspapers to try to convince people that the Constitution's a good idea. And ultimately, they make a promise that if you guys will vote for this Constitution, first thing we'll do when we go to Congress together is we will write a Bill of Rights to protect your individual rights. And for once, this is a promise that politicians kept. Because one of the first things Congress does when we finally do elect a government is they wrote a Bill of Rights. So eventually, the Constitution is ratified by everybody but Rhode Island, and once everybody else is in, they pressure Rhode Island, and Rhode Island joins. So we have the United States. Now, you'll be reading about the Bill of Rights, and be sure you look over these 10 rights, which protect our individual freedoms. The First Amendment especially is highly important because it gives us our right to freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom to petition and to assemble. It's highly important. If you're going to have a democratic republic, a society where we the people have a voice and get to pick our leaders, you have to be able to argue about which leaders we want. You have to have that freedom of speech. You have to be able to question your government. And we have that as part of that First Amendment. So look over that Bill of Rights and be sure you understand why each of these is important, protecting our rights, not only to voice our opinions into religion, but setting up our rights under the legal system and organizing the way that the government balances itself. Now, finally, we have a government, and we hold our first election, and our first president that we choose is George Washington. He would like to retire, but no, we need him. He's the one guy everyone will respect, and so Washington agrees to serve. So we begin our new government in 1889 with Washington as our president. And so we'll now, as we continue on, see what happens next.